Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung Earthlets, and welcome to another episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. On this episode, we're talking to Hilary Barta, who is one of the creators on the Core Buster Special. It's been fantastic over the last few weeks talking to various creators. Lots of new names on the Core Buster Special this time. And Hilary's work you may know from Plastic Man, and also What The for Marvel. Now he's got a very uniquely American perspective on humour comics, so it was fantastic to be able to connect with him. We're also doing another deep dive, this time onto Rob Williams's Dredd work. Now thank you so much for all the positive feedback you've been giving us about the deep dives. Really great fun to be able to chew something over from people we don't normally have on the podcast, and get different perspectives, hopefully, and maybe infect you with a little bit of our enthusiasm for stuff from 2000 AD. This time it's Ian Dunt, who is a political journalist and writer. We talk about Rob Williams's work on Judge Dredd, which we both love, so it's not exactly a battle of wills, but it's great to get his perspective on one of the Dredd writers, I think, not to blow smoke up his backside, but I think Rob's work over the last few years has become incredibly popular with old hands and new readers alike. So it was great to really dig down into Titan and Celadus and Small House, and even Control, which is the new collection that's coming out this year, slightly delayed by the virus, unfortunately. So we're going to crack on. In the meantime, do make sure you head along to 2000ad.com/news, where you will be able to find all the latest things from 2000 AD. Plenty of stuff still going on. Don't forget the 2000 AD in the magazine are still going out. We've had some changes to our publishing schedule, with different collections going out at different times. But Thrill Power will continue through the lockdown, as indeed will the 2000 AD Thrillcast with 2 episodes a week. So we're going to crack on with this one. And first up, it is Hilary Barta, the artist on Kid Kong. So do you want to tell people a bit about yourself? Because I remember your work on Plastic Man from a while ago. But do you want to tell people about you and your background and the kind of comics that you do?
Sure. Well, I've been doing comics for a long time, I guess, since the 1980s. And I started as an inker, and I did that for a long time. And I enjoyed it, but I would sort of periodically burn out. And at some point, I started finding my own ideas for stories. I was writing parodies at Marvel for What The. I did the Plastic Man miniseries that you mentioned, and I sort of found my own groove in this sort of humor, not Bigfoot, cartoony like Charles Schultz or something, but humor with more realistic or dimensional art. So kind of harkening back to Jack Hole, who created Plastic Man, and artists like that. And I'm also influenced by EC Comics, Wally Wood in particular, visually. And I sort of throw all that mix in together and come up with my own goofy sort of take on comic books.
I think for many people, and to a certain degree myself included, in Britain, American humor comics in many people's minds, I think, tends to begin and end with Mad magazine, but of course it's a whole genre over there, isn't it?
Well, sure. I mean, ever since comics began, in fact, comic books here I think there were compilations of comic strips, which were mostly humor at the start. I'm not that up on every bit of golden age comic books, but more fun comics or whatever. You're talking about late 1930s, but all through the 40s, when superheroes started, Batman, Superman, Captain America, those things started taking off. At the same time, there were things like Captain Marvel, which was a more humorous, lighthearted take on superheroes, and Plastic Man, which is Jack Cole's. I mean, Jack Cole is one of my favorite comic creators. and Plastic Man is one of my favorite characters. It started in the 1940s, and it just sort of showed this parallel universe of how you could handle even superheroes. Though there were also comics that were humor comics that had nothing to do with superheroes, funny animals, just silly stories. That has always coexisted in America. Unfortunately, for me anyway, the superhero genre has dominated. And when Marvel took off in the 60s, it really dominated and kind of pushed everything to the side, except perhaps for Mad and a few other lines of comics like Archie and things like that continue.
Before we move on to talking about the Core Buster Special, I do want to kind of dwell on this point about the idea of differences in humour. So many American people, I'm sure many British people as well, will say that the other side of the pond don't get their brand of humour. And then you've got these kind of two parallel, because humour comics in Britain used to be huge. I grew up not just with the Beano and Dandy, but with Whizzer and Chips and Core and Buster and things like that. So at the same time, America's got its own thing. Do you think there's in your knowledge that there's a fundamental difference between humor comics on both sides of the pond, or do they share kind of common threads, do you think?
Well, I must admit, I am not an expert on British humor comics. And in fact, other than doing a story for A1, which is something that an anthology that came out, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, at least, I haven't, it's the first story I can remember doing for a British publisher. But in terms of the sense of humor, the general sense of humor, I don't know how many of those comics were actually popular here, let's say, or even really distributed. The first British comics I remember seeing distributed to comic stores that I picked up were like 2000 AD. And there's certainly a lot of humor in those books, right? I mean, it's a little more teenage or adult, kind of anarchic sort of stuff. Not necessarily, laugh, gag kind of humor. But, then there's Alan Moore. I remember reading the Jeffries saga and things like that, which are, the funnier end of what Alan was doing at the time. I think Americans have always loved British humor. All you have to do is look at the popularity of, films and shows like Monty Python. Certain Americans anyway got it, right? And I imagine there was a reverse sort of cultural exchange at the British end. They loved certain American comics. Perhaps the Marx Brothers caught on there. I don't know. Okay, you don't know either. Anyway, that's dating my cultural references here. Everything's going to be old here. But anyway, I don't know about the comics so much because I don't think those comics made it over here, and I'm not. You'd have to tell me what American humor comics made it to Britain, and frankly, there weren't that many. So superheroes obviously are our greatest export in terms of
comics. Well, from my memory, I think it was mostly Mad and Howard the Duck. That was that was my experience, and even then, you'd I think it was Comag that may have distributed Mad magazine. So you'd maybe see one issue out of every 6 appearing on the newsstand, kind of thing. I mean, you mentioned something there, which was about the notion of like a gags and a gag a minute, gag a page kind of thing. Is that much more the kind of American speed with humor comics that you're wanting those kind of laugh out loud jokes, or is there satire in there as well?
Well, I mean, one of the things I'm known for, Plastic Man was not just gag a minute or gag a page or a panel or whatever. I mean, Mad, the Mad that I grew up with, even before I read the magazines, I read the paperback reprints of the original comics from the 1950s, which were just some of the densest visual, gag-laden kind of comics I'd ever seen and have ever seen. But there's different kinds of humor. There's that sort of satire that Mad did, where they're just throwing everything in there they could, at least at the time. And then there's the adventure or, stories that were not a parody necessarily, but just a humor story, where the humor is just situational, right? Similar to a sitcom or a comic movie or something. I don't know if I'm explaining this properly, but so Plastic Man is a very funny. There are gags in it, but people don't stop and tell jokes in Plastic Man, for instance. It's a funny story. There's a really crazy villain. The action is hysterically funny to me. I don't know if there's one type of American humor that way, right? I mean, so there's different levels of it. And you mentioned Howard the Duck, which was created by Steve Gerber, the writer. He also was doing other books at Marvel at the time, and The Defenders was an example of a comic that was crazy, wacky, weird. He would throw all kinds of stuff in there. I remember there was some sort of elf that would just show up and shoot people, and it went on for issue after issue, and he, never explained it, So, there's different types of humor over here. I'd have to read more British humor to compare the two. What I've seen for this sort of knockabout farce that seems to be common in the British stuff, there isn't as much here. Maybe that was more common in the 40s when there was more humor work, but there isn't anything quite like that over here. Yeah.
For me, reading something like the Core Buster Special, where it's mostly 1, 2, 3 page stories, does to a certain extent evoke the kind of format of Mad, because Mad was one of those comics that bucked the trend in terms of being an anthology as opposed to 1, maybe 2 stories. So I think that's probably one of the reasons maybe why it did so well over here, because it was actually, a lot of the cultural references were American, but it was a format that we understood over here, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
And so this kind of brings me on to talking about Kid Kong, which is the strip that you've done. And do you want to tell us a little bit about when you were offered the gig and what your initial reaction was to this strip?
Well, I just remember kind of being really curious about being offered to do a British humor strip, and I guess it's aimed at younger readers, because I don't get offered much, to be honest with you. I don't get a whole lot of offers these days to do humor comics. There aren't many over here, right? They're few and far between. So I was just really curious about it, and I think a friend of mine recommended me. He might have done a strip, another American comic artist. In any case, I just remember thinking, man, this is really wacky. I mean, the humor in it is broad, but my own limited references to British humor, where I was sort of ticking them off, right? There's a joke about the Prime Minister and the Queen Mother, and I'm in her knickers, so all this stuff is in there, and my reference would be Monty Python, perhaps the I don't know, the Carry On films or the Ealing comedies from the 50s. They're mostly film references, right? Yeah. But it was a lot of fun. I just had to figure out how to draw a Bananasaurus. There were like technical difficulties. How do I draw? What exactly is that going to look like?
For those who haven't seen your work, are you able to kind of describe? I realize that the majority of people are going to be absorbing this podcast are going to be listening to it rather than watching it. Can you describe your style? Because I've seen it described, cartoony, but that's such a broad church.
Yeah, well, like I said, I was sort of probably very crudely saying that there's the Charles Schultz end of Peanuts, which it was referring to as Bigfoot, which is an American way of describing the sort of large proportions of heads and feet in cartoony comics. And at the other end is someone like me. I'm trying to do the same. I can do the same kind of drawing. That is, the proportions are wacky. I generally draw. My editors have always told me your heads are too big. Your heads are too big. But when I do the humor stuff, I just let that go, and I can draw a giant head or whatever. I'm not as concerned about realism, but in terms of proportion. But I do, I draw something. What I like to put it is it's humorously drawn, it's cartoony, but it's realistically lit. Okay, so there's weight to it, there's lighting, there's shadow, there's perspective, there's all those things you might see in an adventure or dark realistic strip, but I'm applying it to making this humor world sort of come to life in 3 dimensions. That's what I'm trying to do anyway.
So I think looking at your work, the thing, well, the most obvious comparison to me is somebody like Roger Langridge, who obviously is a creator who, I mean, he's just been putting stuff up online of his own versions of the Muppets crossed over with 2000 AD characters, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I absolutely get what you mean about that kind of, you know, the solidity. It's not, you know, everything's floating in midair like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's just it's a matter of style, I guess. But for me, film, and I'll mention film a lot in a conversation about comics. Pardon me, but the two comics really are informed by my film, you know, watching. And I grew up watching old American films, so from the classic period of the 30s, 40s, you know, the golden age, as it's called. So the way scenes were put together, you know, the way those guys lit black and white, because all the movies were black and white pretty much. The way they lit them, really it's just sort of, after a while, I think it just becomes part of the way I see things. And when I sit down to draw a page, you know, I'll get a script or I write a script, and there's a scene, I'm probably picturing a scene from a movie, maybe not a certain exact scene, but I've seen establishing shots of buildings so many times. I kind of know, you know, well, I'll pull that particular sort of cliche or reference out of my brain somewhere and try to draw that. But I'm also trying to just capture that 3-dimensional thing that the great cinematographers did, the great directors did, and the great artists have always done, right? They just know how to frame a figure, a panel, and light it so that, you know, it's just the perfect angle to get the expression across, but also create depth and bring you into that world. I just love the idea of pulling people into, like, there's just like a little window. The panel border could be like a little window, or maybe, you know, like a stage, right? A proscenium, where you just sort of you sort of pulled into that little universe of where wacky things are going on. I don't know if that makes any sense.
That brings me neatly onto what I was going to ask about, because with humor comics, as in all humor, timing is everything, and obviously the person who's scripting has to, you know, pitch their jokes properly so they work. But storytelling is such an important aspect of comic books. Do you have an innate ability to you know, just get those moments of timing on the page, or is it something that you've had to learn? And how do you approach storytelling in a humor comic?
Well, I think I've always been sort of a cut up, you know, sort of the kid in the back of the class that would make the jokes. You know, I don't tell jokes, you know, actual jokes. I usually can't remember them. My friends used to make fun of me, like, Hilary, you know, you write humor and all this, but you don't tell jokes. But what I do is my humor in real life, I'm talking about it just as a human being, it's reactive, right? People will be talking and things just, the humor chord will just go up. They'll trigger things, and but I react to what's going on. It's very different when you're creating a story and planning it. It's work, you know. I don't think there's anything innate. I don't have any innate talent for it. I think I have that sense of humor, but applying that into a story is work. You study what works here. What have I seen by other artists and other comics and films? How did they do that? How did it work? And then you try to, you know, you practice and you develop it. But, you know, in the case of like the story I'm doing for Gorebuster, the King Kong story, the script, you know, it's there, and then it's all there. It's all broken down into panels and dialogue and a brief description of the action. And then for me, it's just a matter of choosing angles and like what's the best way to show this. You know, what do we need to see? What do we want to see? What will help set up the next panel? That kind of thing. But it's work. I got to say, it's work. Hopefully, the work doesn't show. You know, the sweat stains and the art aren't there in the comic book. But
the script is by Alec Worley, who's a writer who's done quite a bit of stuff for 2000 AD over the last few years. Was there anything in the script, any reference or anything? I mean, I know it's only a short script. Was there anything in there that you looked at and went, I haven't got a clue what he's talking about in this?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm trying to remember if there was any expression that I had to look up, kind of Google and see what does that mean. But whatever. I have a few British friends. I'm not clueless in this, in sort of the slang terms or whatnot. I'm trying to remember. I don't think so. There may have been one. I wish I had the script in front of me. I can't recall. There may have been one or two terms where it took me a second to realize, oh, they're referring to the whatever. But yeah, nothing in particular. There was no real speed bumps there. Yeah.
Was there anything? Because I'm very interested by the fact that so much of your frame of reference is classic films. Because of course, King Kong is the classic film from the 1930s. He said, reaching back into his memory banks for that one. Was there? Did you draw on that for your version of King Kong, or were you more looking at because Tiernan Trevelyan did the King Kong in the previous Core Buster special?
Yeah, well, I was sent to again. I'm not having seen the character ever before. I didn't know this character. I'm sorry to say, I'm ignorant, but I did. They sent me 2 strips. The previous one, I think, and which was a full color strip, which was great, and then a more classic, maybe that's from the 80s or 70s, I don't know, a black and white strip. So I saw 2 different versions from 2 different artists and their take, and I saw, okay, you could draw, you have some license with the way you draw the character. I probably am a little closer. Am I a little closer to the original? Actually, I think I am a little closer to the black and white version. But that was really my reference when I Googled Kid Kong to find more art. I didn't find a whole lot. There was some more of that older stuff, but there wasn't a whole lot available. So I went with what I had. Did I draw on King Kong? or any other, but I mean, I've seen enough. I've actually, apes and gorillas and primate characters are big in comics. I mean, DC. I don't know if it was the Julie Schwartz years, but they loved gorilla characters. Angel and the Ape was a comic that was around back in the 60s and 70s maybe, and then anyway, DC loved the gorilla characters. There's plenty of villains and secondary characters that are apes, and somebody at DC had an ape fetish, I'm sure. Yeah.
Wait, looking at the original by Robert Nixon, there's something wonderfully avuncular. He's goofy. He's meant to be a little bit simple. He's got the funny little hat on his head that is completely out of proportion to the rest of him. While appreciating that you've only spent a little bit of time with him because it was only a handful of pages. How do you feel about characters like Kid Kong, where it's drawing on a culture reference but doing something silly, goofy, odd with it?
Well, I immediately got the character, right? I mean, the big, goofy, sort of dumb guy. That's the bull. He's sort of the bull in the china shop. He's always breaking the glass. Literally, in this story, they're in a museum and he's bumping into things. That's like in the first panel you see him. He's knocking some ancient treasure over, accidentally, not even knowing he's doing it. That I immediately got that character, and there's essentially, I don't know how much his character's been explored to greater depth in other short stories, but in this one, he's sort of like this big, playful kid, but he's built like a tank, right? So, but he's just having fun. So there's all this destruction going on. He's battling what you would consider the villain or his opponent, the antagonist in the story, this monster, and he just thinks that it's a lark, right? It's just completely, there's no malice at all in the whole thing, and that was very enjoyable. I totally got it right away. I also love that it's a story for kids, but the action in it is pretty extreme, And one thing that you run into doing humor comics, because either when they're intended for kids, or whether people just assume it's a humor comic, that means kids are going to read it. It's for kids. You run into this whole PC thing of you have to be careful of the content. This story just is like, just going to wreak havoc. I don't know. it's very goofy, but it's pretty over the top action, and I really enjoyed that.
What do you think of is the worth of humor comics? So I know everybody likes a laugh, but like I said earlier, humor comics was such a big thing in the UK. Like, you know, there are dozens and dozens of titles, and now we're down basically in terms of pure humor titles to the Beano, and you know, we revived Core Buster last year. What do you think is the worth of humor comics? Do they just throw away, or do they do something deeper for us?
Well, look, humor, anything that makes you laugh is a good thing. I mean, a smile on a human face is like bringing joy into the world. Even if that smile is a smirk or, you know, or a derisive laugh, it's a positive thing. And there's one of the, you know, I don't want to get pretentious at all, but in writing Plastic Man, I was one of the co-plotters, at least, of that series, and working on my parodies at Marvel. There was an intent beyond just doing a gag. I mean, I remember I was inking, like I said, before I got into writing and drawing stories at Marvel. I was really limited to drawing parodies for the Marvel comic book What the back then. That's when I first started writing and drawing. And I remember telling my editor when I was inking just prior to doing the What the stories, I remember telling him, you know, this is the last time I'm going to ink the Punisher. Okay, I was inking a cover. And I think I actually signed my name Barta, Hilary instead of the other way around, because it was like, okay, I'm just filling out a form, right? And I later felt bad, like I might have been insulting the penciler or something. But I told the editor, I said, you know, that's it. Don't offer me any more work. I don't want to be tempted by it. I just hate this character so much, because he was the first character to just pull out a gun and kill people, and that was a hero. Whereas all the other Marvel characters, you know, they would save people or they would battle a villain, but they wouldn't just be going around shooting and whatever. It was a little too much of a gun kind of, you know, destroyer or whatever, you know, avenging right wing whatever kind of scenario for me. So I said no more. Well, then when the same editor, this is Carl Potts I'm talking about. Carl said, well, we're doing this humor book. I said, oh, can I do a Punisher parody? You know, and so I really wanted to make fun of this character that I hated, that I really didn't think was a good influence on children, right? So I wasn't making it a message that got in the way of the humor, but the message was always there for me. I want to undermine this character. I want people to find him hilariously funny and stupid, and look at the cliches or the tropes and what they really mean. Just like Harvey Kurtzman did in the original Mad. He was sort of pointing at Superman and Batman and advertising and everything else and saying, look, the Emperor has no clothes, you know. So to me, there's all kinds of levels to meaning. You can bring all kinds of, seriousness to humor, if you want to put it that way, right? You can add that to it. Or it's, and the best way to do it, of course, is to just sort of have it there for the readers that look for it. You're not hitting them over the head with it. Well, maybe you actually are literally hitting them over the head with it in the humor comic. But the message is delivered through the jokes, not on top of it.
I mean, it seems that you're very much in tune with the overriding thing in British humor comics, which is irreverence. Yeah. Which is, nothing must be po-faced. Everything must be, the lofty must be brought low. And it's something I've talked about with other guests on the podcast, about how leveling an awful lot of British comics humor is. Like I said, the lofty are brought low, the meek are brought up. I'm
sure partly as a result of the class system, right, that everyone's labored under for all those centuries.
I mean, that is an entire different subject to go into. But yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. It's like there's a point of view which about British culture in a lot of it in the past can be seen to have been like a pressure valve to let off some of the steam of the class system by letting people laugh at their superiors, as it were, rather than inciting them to rebellion and all that. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that.
It's generally a good idea to punch up, right? Anyway, if you're going to do jokes, make fun of the big guy. You don't want to make fun of someone beneath you. That's generally bullying, right? So.
Absolutely, and I think it's something that that's baked into American history as well, because of the whole Boston Tea Party thing. It's like, oh, you like tea, do you? Well, have the biggest cup of tea in the world, kind of thing. While dressing up as quote unquote Red Indians as well. I thought it was hilarious.
That was maybe perhaps one of the first improvs in America. I don't know.
You know what? I think there needs to be an alternative history of America where it's improv groups getting slightly out of control and just kicking off revolutions and things like that. But Hilary, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for chatting about this. If people want to find you online, where can they come and get you?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I have a Patreon page with my name, and hopefully that's easy to find. I could send you that information or whatever, but yeah, I'm generally floating around on the Twitter and the Instagram and all that stuff. Yeah.
Brilliant, lovely. Well, thank you so much for this chat. That's been brilliant, and kind of spot on time as well. Which
perfect.
Wonderful.
So, for those who do watch this, here's some of the pages.
Excellent.
Here's some of the art. Thank you for the interview, Michael. It was nice to meet you.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure meeting you, and stay safe.
Okay, and we'll do better at trying to get each other's jokes from now on. Okay, we'll work on that. We'll reach across the ocean.
Good plan. Okay.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. Super stuff. Thank you so much to Hilary for chatting away there. Fantastic to get new names, particularly people with long storied careers in humour comics from American humour comics. The Core Buster special. If you've not picked it up, please do so. We're currently running a promotion on the regened issues, just trying to encourage more youngsters, new readers to pick up 2000 AD, and the Core Buster special from the Treasury of British Comics is a perfect title to while away a few hours during your lockdown. Next up is Ian Dunt, who's the editor of politics.co.uk, where we're talking about the work of Rob Williams on on Judge Dredd, and how much we love it, and the kind of things that we think it represents and says about the future's greatest lawman. So prepare for some F-bombs, prepare for some spoilers as we chat away to Ian about Dredd. For those people listening and watching who don't know you, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, my name's Ian Dunt. I'm the editor of politics.co.uk and the author of How to Be a Liberal.
Excellent.
And I do a bunch of sort of,
Excellent.
Political journalism, I suppose.
So
I basically lose my mind in a protracted way on TV, radio, and in the pages of the press about the growth of nativism. That's essentially my professional duty at this stage.
Okay. And when you're not doing that, you read comics, and we've had many conversations about comics, and particularly the ones that you wanted to talk about were Rob Williams's run on Judge Dredd. Now, Rob is one of the kind of I say new tier, but he's been working for us for like over a decade. So kind of Al Ewing, Cy Spurrier, Mike Carroll, people like that, and Rob Williams, and he's kind of built his own little world within Dredd, mostly as a result of the Low Life series that came up. That ended up having big kind of ramifications for Dredd's world. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to talk about Rob's work, and in particular the kind of Titan and Enceladus storyline that we've had over the last few years.
Yeah, because what I'm mostly talking about is the stuff he's done with Flint. So I suppose, a bit of Trifecta, which he was one of the writers involved in, certainly Titan, certainly Enceladus, and then mostly I think The Small House. There's a sort of, I like his work anyway. Like, I like the work he does for DC. I really like that Royals Masters of War stuff he did for, I think, Vertigo, before it turned into Black Label, which is basically just fucking Vertigo, but under a different name. And of course, I really like Dredd. I've been reading Dredd all my life. But I sort of think something happens when Rob Williams meets Dredd. And the thing that happens is that Rob Williams' writing becomes from very good to fucking extraordinary. And Dredd goes into that top-notch space that it sometimes has. You just think like really important things are happening here, not just in terms of plot, not just in terms of character, but properly in like the guts of Dredd, like the thematic content, the political content, the extent to which it has something to say about the world. So I like them both. The moment he's back on a Dredd strip, I take, what is it, like 5 pages? I mean, I'd probably take a good sort of 10 minutes to read just those 5. I fucking savor that shit when it comes out. Just like, okay, this is the special stuff that's coming. It's like the best whiskey from the back of the top shelf that's coming out. So yeah, that's the reason I'm going to pick them out especially.
Because Rob's talked on this podcast and in interviews about the way he views the voice of Dredd, and he always comes back to that Wagner panel description, which was Dredd grim. You know, that's a kind of touchstone for him. But how much do you think Rob's voice echoes Wagner's, and how is it different to Wagner's?
Yeah, this is spot on. Okay, and I think the echo is there's a kind of intuitive grasp of exactly the right distance to take from the character. It's almost like you're inside the skull, but just inside the skull. You're never really, because Dredd doesn't really have the capacity for internal assessment. So if you went any closer in, I think you'd start to dismantle what the character's about. He uses the third person, but he uses it with just nudging his way a little bit closer into these kind of like underlying tectonic plates that sort of shift in the way that Dredd thinks, insofar as he really can properly think. And then presents him, and this is the part that I think is different to what Wagner does. I think that's fair to say. Presents him with moral problems, moral by virtue of Dredd's morality, which his brain just isn't suited to be able to deal with. And that's actually kind of oddly similar. This is not a comparison that most people would make, but to the best stories with like Superman and Captain America, right? Where you would always, that really boring old argument with those characters of, you can't do an interesting story with them because they're too, goody two-shoes. The thing to do with those characters was basically to put them in a morally grey situation and see how they respond. You can do the same thing to Dredd, but by virtue of his morality, it's basically, how does fascism work and does it live up to your idea of the law? But by doing that, and then by having a proper grasp on his voice, judged by distance, by that specific intuitive sense of just how close to get to him, you start to get to the golden nugget.
I mean, I've mentioned on the podcast before, and I've written about it as well, about how Dredd is a micro actor in a big world. And the second you ask him to think more broadly about what he's doing, it all begins to fall apart, because for all of his talk of justice, he never fully engages with the fact that the regime in Megacity 1 is not a just one. It is disproportionately brutal and cruel. And you come to the kind of tour of duty style stuff where, he starts thinking about justice, not just as an abstract concept, but also its ramifications and its consequences for ordinary life and for the law. And that's, within a year or so of that, you've got the Chaos Day, and there's a whole thing to be discussed and picked over about whether that weakened. I've seen a few people talk about how, and I really like this as a viewpoint, that the whole of Dredd, the entire story, the last 43 years, has actually been about the fall of Megacity 1. Oh. It has been one managed decline after another, and I have a lot of sympathy for that viewpoint. And every time you kind of pick a story, you go, actually, yeah, that really does fit into that. And for me, Rob it deals with that notion as a way of Dredd as symbol of Megacity 1. So you look at something like Titan, where it is all about Amy Nixon breaking him down as far as he will get. What is the point where Dredd will break? How low can we bring him before he goes? And for me, that is the perfect metaphor for Megacity 1.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, there's something to be said about just how drenched in the continuity and how sort of light-footed he is in managing it, right? Like it is, there's a very specific pleasure that you get from this stuff. And it is the pleasure that, you know, if I was honestly to say to someone, you know, someone to, how do I get into Dredd? I actually wouldn't pick any of these stories because although you can get it, right? You can get it without having read it all your life. But if you have read it all your life, that's where the proper pleasure is. You know, there's a scene where Hershey just finds a small hair on her face and plucks it out, and like, you know, and sort of whispers to herself, "McGregor." And you're like, I mean, you know, that's decades of your life that you've been reading this shit. It's very lightly done. There's no sort of effort to sort of explain that stuff to you. There's a moment where Dredd on sort of Titan in an offhand way sort of says, "Oh, the Sabbath operation," when he last did a sort of parachute dive from space, which again, no one's making a big deal of this stuff. But if you know it, if you get it, and then especially on the character work, especially between Dredd and Hershey, if you're drenched in that, you will get a supreme amount of joy. And there's a lot of the stuff in comics, including superhero comics, is about you know, playing in your sandpit and then putting, you know, all the toys away when you're done. But actually, it takes quite a good balancing act to make sure that you're building up your own stories, and which Williams is. I mean, you know, he's like you say, he's playing in his own area, but also paying sort of proper respect to all of the stuff that came before you and is happening around you. So as a team player and a solo player, this stuff is sort of top notch. That goes then as well for Day of Chaos. I mean, I sort of feel, I mean, pretty much, I think all of these stories come post Day of Chaos, and in fact have sort of framed the way from Trifecta onwards. You know, it was seen, and they properly give you that sense of sort of empire crumbling down, which matches basically Dredd's body and his convictions, both of which are also crumbling around him. So you get this real sense of twilight and of like desperation. It is properly majestic stuff, which is drenched in an awareness. I mean, only someone who really, really got it and has been getting it for decades is properly able to write this stuff in that kind of way.
I mean, the phrase you used is light touch, and that for me is where Dredd has always excelled. Whoever is writing him, when it's properly good, it is tapping into that continuity. But you do not have to have read it in order to enjoy it as a story. You know, it's not a superhero standing there and going, well, you know, this is just like that event back then, and in order to understand my actions now, you need to it's you know, as you say, it deepens the enjoyment, it deepens the story, but it doesn't get in the way of you know, cracking on. I mean, again, I've mentioned this multiple times. My earliest exposure to Dredd was the hot dog run. Where you've got Judge Giant, you've got the rookies, you've got the Cursed Earth, you've got Scabby Hayes, who, you know, this mutant raider and everything, but everything is there. And now that I know all the continuity that happened before the hot dog run, it's a much deeper story. It's just as enjoyable, you know, but I get so much more out of it. But as a kid reading it, those offhand references spark my imagination. They make me curious. They make me think, oh, I'd love to know about, you know, even if you don't get the reference, even just the mention of the reference makes it feel deeper than if the reference wasn't there. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And it's especially, there is a culture in comics of where do I start? Which is, you know, it's a perfectly natural question to ask. It's a very reasonable, but of course, any comics person knows it's completely absurd. And you should, and of course, I mean, in Dredd, there's almost like a fucking literary subgenre on trying to tell people where to start. And people should probably be a bit more. There was that pleasure as a child of picking up, you know, I don't know, X Factor 173 or whatever, and just reading and feeling that sense of lore and of myth and all of the stuff that's come beforehand. You can get into. Nevertheless, I do have to say, I think for me, especially in these strips, because it's so masterfully done, that sense of continuity, a huge amount of the pleasure I get from them comes from the history of it. So even that, it would never be the stuff that I would recommend to someone when they ask me. And by the way, no one ever fucking asks me how do I start to get into this comic? Because any conversation I have about comics is me trying to force the conversation onto comics to people who look like they want to leave. But regardless, if they did, an imaginary person, then that wouldn't be my recommendation.
I always love it when you tweet about comics and it's just about 10, 15, maybe 20% of the replies are all, comics? What are you doing about comics for?
I know. Yeah, I'm sure I lose a lot of followers every time I do that, but I do not give a fuck. So,
but come back to Rob's stuff. Let's take Titan for a bit of an analysis, because, like I said, Nixon's plan is to break Dredd down as a man, to force him to accept that he is just a man. You know, the law, even the law, has its limits. There's something that feels very Wild West about that. I don't know why. I don't know whether it's because of just how utterly how Nixon and all the other inmates on Titan are the antithesis of the law. You know, they are bent judges. They are the worst of the worst. And then here you've got the ultimate symbol of the law. And I mean, what's your feeling when you go through Titan? What what's the sense of the story that Rob is trying to tell?
So, I mean, the first part feels almost like one of those classic approaches that people have to Batman or something, which is basically, let's break it. You know what I mean? So, you know, he goes through the emotional ringer, and a lot of those scenes feel slightly like that, although they have this much more unsettling quality, which is introduced by the amnesia drug that they give him. So he wakes up, he's completely smashed up. You yourself, Williams is very good, by the way, at playing with timelines to make you see an event, see the repercussions of an event before you're actually able to see the event. He wakes up, he's completely battered, there's teeth coming out of his mouth, he's presented with a situation, and then you only realize this is the fifth time or whatever he's gone through it, which is basically having the shit kicked out of him, and duly, as is his role, kicking the shit out of a lot of people as well. But the point that I sort of always felt that story wanted to get to is the point where I mean, spoilers all over this discussion, but I presume that's just how it goes, where he doesn't blow up the carrier that's taking the former judges off to Enceladus. And that, to me, has this echo of the Apocalypse War. Now, it's not, I mean, you know, he'd probably blow that fucker up if it wasn't for Gerhardt saying to him, look, I really do need to insist you don't do this. But never, like, it's hard to read that without having that callback back to the Apocalypse War, where he does the precise opposite. And this is something that you get, especially in his writing on Dredd, which is, you know, glacial change in character development. Now, it's a weird hobby to have, to pay a lot of attention to a kind of, you know, science fiction that gives you character development portioned out over decades, which is basically how Dredd works. He's had a new thought like roughly every 12 years. But nevertheless, in that case, it makes it quite meaningful. And you actually do really have a sense of there is change here. He is grappling with something, and that he has been, you know, going through, I think, arguably over the last sort of 15 years or so as a character, especially in his relation to what happened in the Apocalypse War. And of course, that harks back to then that all coming back to bite his ass and everybody else's in Day of Chaos. So there is, to me, that was always the moment that story was working its way towards. And that was the moment that story really, really landed.
I saw some criticism after Day of Chaos that some readers felt there wasn't enough consequences. You know, you didn't get the blossoming of stories that you did after the Apocalypse War. So that, you know, there wasn't the fatties and all this, that, and the other. But I think you're right what you said earlier, which is that Rob is one of the writers who has really grappled with the consequences of the Chaos Day, not in saying, oh, look at the silly things that the citizens are doing, but the consequences to Dredd, because Chaos Day was that tipping point where people all of a sudden went, oh, so there are consequences to actions, in the same way that Dredd pushing that button is a consequence to the Soviet invasion, which is itself, you know, a consequence of previous actions. And it's that kind of, was it Machiavelli who said, wars may start when you will, but they will not end when you wish. or words to that effect.
Mm.
So, and you know, that notion of blood begats blood, that you know, everything that's happened up to Chaos State and beyond is fault is a blame word, but it is a consequence of that single button push. I mean, it's incredible that a single panel has had such an effect over the years.
Yeah, and I mean, not just that. I mean, I've written about. I think I wrote about this in the Guardian once. It also had a big effect on me. I mean, I remember that, but you know, you were saying my first Dredd story. Now, I don't think that was my first Dredd story, but it's the first place my brain goes to when I try to remember that. These old sort of, they used to have like American size format comics of Dredd stuff, which I think was probably published for the American market. I don't know.
Yeah, the Eagle reprints.
Right, yeah, and it was one of those. Funnily enough, I think I nabbed it from a hairdresser's in Winchester or something. Anyway, it just destroyed me, and it destroyed me in that really fundamental way of you know, as a child, you just presume he's a superhero, and you're just given this moment of like, you know, this is not a hero for you to admire, which, by the way, thematically is pretty much the dominant motif of what Williams is then doing, mostly in the Small House. Although in a, you know, in a far updated way. And on that basis, that button push stays with you, I think, throughout. I mean, I'd be amazed if there's that. I would presume that for most Dredd fans, that's the key moment that they would always come back to, because it's a moment that's not just doing something about a character, it's doing something about a genre, and it's also saying something to you about power in general and politics in general, which is do not trust authorities. Now, you can do that in, you know, I don't know how much criticism of people around the program you're going to want on these things, but I mean, there are sometimes 2000 AD does that in a way that is quite sort of a bit boring and a little bit sort of teenage and a bit easy, and sometimes it does it in a way that's genuinely fucking challenging your sense of right and wrong and your sense of trust and your assumptions about politics in the world around you. That original moment and some of the stuff that comes later, especially through Dredd, are examples of precisely that.
Let's talk about the Small House and the particular moment in the Small House, because I want to get your perspective on this, particularly considering the book you've been writing over sort of the past 2 years.
2 years feels like
2 years, blimey. And that's the moment in the Small House when Dredd is talking to Smiley,
yeah.
and you have that incredible page where Smiley just says, "We're fascists." And the view is of Dredd, and he's just stood there, and he seems almost kind of frozen in stone in that moment, because as far as Smiley is concerned, he's dropping a bit of a truth bomb. You know, he's reminding Dredd what the situation is, and come back to what I was saying earlier. That comes up against everything Dredd believes in. You know, he believes that the law is the law. It's not politics. It's this fundamental in existence. But Smiley is essentially saying, no, it's politics. It was only ever politics. Don't kid yourself. You're beyond that kind of thing. But I want to get your perspective on that moment, not just in terms of your writing, but also you as a Dredd reader.
Yeah, I mean, so okay. First of all, that moment is remarkable, and it's part of a genius which is not just Williams, which is also Flint's, and which is also something about the two of them together. You get that point where artists and writers are so in tune with each other, where their chemistry is so good, that moments are able to breathe in a way that isn't about how much sort of real estate they use. It's not about page count. It's about the sort of mounting of a moment, and that moment is perfectly fucking. I mean, it is delivered like with proper aplomb. I think the key line, weirdly enough, doesn't come then. It actually comes, it's completely in line with what you're saying, but it comes later where Smiley says it was never about the law, it was about control, which is really at the heart of the fascist thing. I mean, the reason that Dredd doesn't realize he's a useful tool in the fascist system and thinks that he is just black and white abiding by the law is because he doesn't recognize the fact that it is a fascist state. I mean, Smiley is completely correct in that. Dredd later dismisses him by saying these are just words, which is basically because he doesn't really have the capacity for abstract thought. So he doesn't have any understanding of what that word entails. But it's true that it's actually about control. And this is what I was alluding to earlier, saying that thing like, you know, it's like Superman or Captain America being put in a morally grey situation. Dredd is being presented with something where what he perceives to be the law, right or wrong, i.e. his completely black and white view of the world, is in fact part of a system that is completely corrupted and not intended for what he thinks it is. He thinks it is, you know, for the goodness of the people. In fact, that's not Smiley's account at all. Then something quite extraordinary happens, right? Because this could all have been a kind of meta commentary from a writer to basically say to, you know, anyone doubting out there, because we all sometimes, I think, feel that sometimes the satire of Dredd isn't fully understood by all the people that read it or all the people that are aware of it, right? And this stuff has fucking consequences, man. I mean, you look at the way the American far right has embraced the Punisher logo and failed to recognize that that character is not really something you should be looking up to in any way, shape or form. I mean, it does matter that people get it. And it would be quite easy for a writer to do a piece which is basically just meta commentary, to go, look, by the way, guys, it's fascism, and leave it at that. What the Small House does is something, I think, more complicated, because for the reasons we just put forward, but then it does something quite weird and extraordinary, which is that Dredd's problem with what Smiley is doing is that he's not following chain of command. And yet his only response to it, because he doesn't trust Hershey, is to not follow the chain of command. And so you're put in this situation where not only is the thematic stuff, like the proper political content, going on, but the character is being put in the situation where their own moral contortions are beyond what they really have the intellectual capacity to grasp with. And that's where the proper fucking drama comes. And that then gets to the scene. And the scene that lasts for me in that series is, more than any, is the moment with Hershey, where he's like, I don't recognize your authority. And that, I mean, look, I remember reading that because I threw the fucking prog down on the floor and I just thought, Jesus Christ, and started walking around the flat. I was like, whoa, my fucking God. Because everything had come together in one moment, including that crucial thing of the chain of command, that Dredd is operating like the thing that he thinks he is designed to stop. And of course, then when he later goes to Hershey and starts saying, well, look, why the fuck are you authorizing these assassination sort of missions here and all that? And she's like, well, what the fuck do you think we are? This is what chief judges have done the entire time. And of course, it's exactly the kind of thing that he himself has done and taken in. So you're seeing like the breakdown of character. You're seeing like proper delivery on decades of character work. You're seeing real thematic content. I mean, that is comics right there. And crucially of all, like that to me was probably the comics event of the year that year, that moment with him and Hershey. And yet, you know, like you look at Marvel DC, which I really like, and you don't particularly. You and I have had many fights where you're like, it's shitty, and just live with it.
But they're not fights. They're mature, calm exchanges of views. No, the fact that we're both drunk at the time is neither here nor there.
Exactly, you're entirely correct. But like their events, you know, how many times have we read the same thing over and over again? You know, worlds will live, worlds will die. You know, a character dies. Fine. You know what a major dramatic beat is in those events. That moment with Hershey, I mean, there's no worlds will live, worlds will die. You're just getting payoff of years of like proper, well thought through thematic character work. And it is intensely satisfying and delivered. When we say mounting a moment, you know, that page is so well composed, like so beautifully composed. Each of the panels works. The pacing of it works. The character work in terms of expressions in the art pays off so well. The scripting is perfect. Fuck me. I mean, I'm saying all of this. I'm probably going to read it as soon as I put this thing down. I mean, it is absolute genius.
What I love about that exchange is it loops in with something that Al Ewing wrote in one of his Dredd stories, where Dredd goes into Hershey's office and starts basically telling her what to do, and she has a right go at him, you know, and says, you know, you swan in here, you threaten me with a badge that you're never going to let go. Piss off, you know. You can't keep doing this, and so if anything, Smiley is kind of a wake up call for Dredd, in that he shows that the blade cuts both ways. For all of the latitude that Dredd has in what he does, so does Smiley. But Dredd doesn't like what Smiley does. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you can't kind of play roughshod over the rules, over the law, and then get annoyed when other people do it too. And I think that's a great analogy for the age. that we're living in now, where, you know, when people are actively flouting conventions because they say, oh, we don't need them, and then getting annoyed when other people do exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, I mean, and you know, this goes to the heart, but like lots of the political issues we have right now, and also lots of the ideas that swirl around, especially with fascism versus liberalism, of the, when you have a rules-based order, either internationally or nationally, the purpose of that isn't so much the rule itself, but to create an equal playing ground for everyone. And that actually, I mean, you know your English Civil War history rather better than I do. But like that, a lot of that comes down to, there's one of the levelers called Overton, who was chucked in a cell and sort of realized, where he's like, first of all, I got basically fucked by the king. Now I'm getting fucked by, maybe we should have a set of individual rights around people so that whoever wants to fuck us doesn't get the chance to do it, even if I'm on the winning side, which is at the core of sort of most liberal thought. But basically, you know, everyone's a minority eventually. You know, that's why we have the rules to make sure that when it's your turn to be a minority, you don't get screwed over as well. That rules-based order is exactly, you know, essentially what Dredd thinks he's supporting. And I think that he does think he's supporting. And there's something to be said, by the way, for the way that Williams genuinely finds, it's not quite heroism in him, but at least grandeur in his personality and dignity in his personality, even though he is a sort of plaything of things that he doesn't really understand. And that's, of course, the opposite of what Smiley is doing when he says this is about control. It's not about laws. And Smiley, also, you could say there's a point where he comes out on the wall towards the climax of the small house, and he looks out at the cursed earth and sort of goes, well, look, that's what we're trying to stop. You know, that it's to control this stuff, this just smashing down our walls that we do this, which of course is exactly, you know, what Mussolini and Hitler would say about sort of communism or about sort of social disease. It's always that we are the barrier, right? Except that the people they always end up killing are the people on the other side of the barrier, because as Smiley allowed to happen, the Apocalypse War was only able to take place because he kept that file. And that's precisely the same thing that you saw in fascist states. They will happily fuck with the security of their people, no matter how much they say that they're intended to substantiate.
Well, it's the whole thing about the big lie, really, isn't it? That is something that Wagner planted, I mean, decades ago now. And why, you know, when I've been writing about Dredd and been thinking, is he actually fascist, or is he just totalitarian and all this and the other? And you kind of come down to, no, he is fascist because there is a lie at the center of it all. It's not just about grabbing control and keeping it. There's that lie that is fed to the people, which is, we will keep you safe.
Mm-hmm.
And what's been really interesting about what Rob has been doing, to some extent what Mike Carroll has been doing as well, is kind of challenging the re-emergence of the big lie after Origins. Because, you know, they had that incredible moment with Hershey and Dredd and Fargo, where Fargo says it wasn't meant to be forever. But Dredd comes out of Origins, all guns blazing, you know, renewed purpose and all this, that, and the other. And you kind of, what is so amazing about Titan, what is so amazing about Enceladus and the Small House, and we'll come on to talking about the Judge Pin stuff in a second, is just how much Williams is challenging that, is actually kind of poking that and going, well, you're not on the firm footing that you think you are, Dredd, you know?
Yeah. Well, he doesn't really get to have faith at this stage in almost any part of the system around him, nor in his own body. I mean, the body plays quite an extreme role in Williams' stuff. Like, it's a repeated motif of the body is falling apart. And there was, I mean, I'm not sure if I've kept track of it. There was a sort of allusion in another strip, to him being sort of physically fixed up, which made me quite disappointed, because I sort of thought, no, I really like the idea of him falling apart. Partly because, again, it does that thing that 2008, especially Dredd, does, that you can't get from superhero comics, which is that sense of real change. Because you do get the sense people are getting older. I mean, you look at like an Anderson strip, and she doesn't look exactly the same as she did when I was, 12 years old. She now looks like she is aged. And he uses that, I think, quite well as a sort of parallel to, yes, the destruction of Mega City 1, but also the destruction of the kind of values that he always thinks that he's held. You get that sense that he's terribly, terribly lonely. And yet, there are these moments, there's some fucking incredible character work there, actually, where he is reaching out to people. There's a moment with Sam, you know, that Brit-Sit judge that gets brought over to Mega City, where he's sort of hard, he trusts him, but he doesn't, you know, he's being pretty brusque with him. Who would have thought? And they go off, and Sam basically forces a conversation. And Dredd says, "Oh, you don't waste time with small talk, do you?" And just in that, like, if you've been following this character, you know it's like the highest praise he could give. I mean, just by that, you're like, okay, he likes him. He really, really likes him. It's like basically the most generous thing you can possibly fucking say to him right now. So you do get that sense that he does have these loyalties. And of course, and by the way, of course, the perfect moment for that is actually delivered by Flint, presumably under direction, but which is Dredd's chin when he thinks he's going to have to shoot Dirty Frank. He actually doesn't do in the end. But that work is done. I mean, of course, it's Dredd, right? You can't see his eyes. There's no script to deliver it. All you get is a weakening of his grimace, basically, which is like, you really see in that moment, Dredd really, really, really doesn't want to shoot Dirty Frank. Like, that is quite profound. And actually, it's a really genuinely moving moment. And he, in fact, allows himself to be shot. I mean, presumably he could have handled the situation if he needed to. He allows himself to be shot. He just doesn't want to shoot Dirty Frank. And also it's made more meaningful by the fact that it's Dirty Frank, who is one of the most preposterous characters in the world, who I love dearly. And also who, because one day the missus saw his name, well, over my shoulder when I was reading a comic and laughed for about 5 minutes. Now, every time I get a stain on me or drop something, she's like, "You're Dirty Frank." She doesn't know anything else about him, but Dirty Frank is my name whenever I fuck something up. So it's also partly me. And on that, even though he's so terribly lonely, and I think Dredd is lonelier in Williams strips than he is probably in any other capacity, certainly than he is in Wagner strips. I mean, Wagner was willing to go much further with his warmth towards Hershey over the last year. Right. Yeah. So the moment that's most heartbreaking is Dredd's face when he thinks he's going to have to shoot Dirty Frank, which is done with half a face, because you're not allowed to see his eyes, delivered by Flint like extraordinarily well, no scripting, but it's basically just the look of, it's about as emotional as I think you're ever going to see Dredd get, as long as the emotion isn't anger. Excluding anger, it's as emotional as you're ever going to see him get, because he just really, really doesn't want to fucking shoot Dirty Frank. And in fact, does not shoot Dirty Frank and allows himself to get shot. That kind of moment lands with me even more. I mean, partly because I really like Dirty Frank, but also just because Dirty Frank is this incredibly absurd character. And Dredd's warmth towards him, I just find one of the most charming things I could possibly. I mean, it is absolutely wonderful. So when I find that moment really, really very emotional. The whole Dirty Frank arc that's portrayed in that thing is exquisite and so melancholy. That there's a moment, when you go into his past, of they're going to keep the house clean basically by killing these children. He goes out into the snow, and that's where he starts saying the word dirty, which is almost like a sort of hold the door moment from Game of Thrones, of just like everything coming together and realizing like the proper tragedy at the heart of this character. Like, it's amazing. And so you do get this, you get this sense of Williams as well. I mean, Dredd is never more alone than he is under Williams, but you do get this sense of he's reaching out. He wants to express something towards people. There's oddly enough, there's more emotional content to him, or a sort of a really buckled down, trapped in yearning for trust and loyalty towards people than you do under other writers, apart from, I think, Wagner, who's probably willing to take it further, and certainly has taken it further in recent weeks with his reaction to Hershey's supposed death.
It's interesting in the light of that, then, the fact that with the Small House, Williams sacrifices characters. He sacrifices people who have grown close to Dredd. Leaving Dirty Frank aside for a moment, do these ends carry the requisite emotional weight, or are they disposed of a bit too freely? I mean, I've seen both sides of the argument online. What's your take on that?
Dirty Frank isn't, and that's done terribly well. As much as I was sad to see him go, I to be honest, I could have used a bit more Sam. I mean, I thought we were getting somewhere with Sam, and he was going to make you know, a really valuable sort of supporting character. I mean, he'd gone through a lot in a very short period of time. Started off as this, you know, naive, idealistic Brexit architect, and pretty quickly had to destroy all of that on Intelligence, and then comes. I mean, there was also, I mean, you know, there's a wonderful, almost a full-page spread of him looking out the city and talking about order, and lots of his thoughts around order sort of mimic the themes of the book. And I was going quite warmly, and I probably thought it wouldn't have done any harm to get him through, not least because you've got enough of a whack with Dirty Frank. But who am I to fucking, you know, I'm reading that shit. It gave me a massive amount of pleasure. I'm just like, you know, I can't really fault any of the judgments that were made there. I kind of get a weird, perverse pleasure for some reason. No story can pass or could have passed without Williams fucking up Gerhardt in some terrible way. He has a worse time of it than Star does in Preacher. You know, Star Wars is like every arc, it's like he will lose another body part. Like, you sort of get the same thing here. And there's some, I mean, Titan has one of the best Gerhardt moments where he's, you know, even the other judge looks at him. He's like literally half a man left, just being like, look at the state of you, mate. Like, you're not really going to crack on. He's like, I'm fired, off he goes. So, but sometimes he actually managed to make it through the small house, which I wasn't expecting.
But Gerhardt is one of those characters who I think is the perfect kind of Rob Williams foil for Dredd. You know, he's introduced these supporting characters, and with Gerhardt, he is Dredd's not conscience, but he always seems to kind of snap Dredd back away from the edge in lots of places. You know, and that's that includes in Fit, where you know, he essentially assesses Dredd for street duty. And sometimes I feel like Gerhardt is the best kind of SJS judge, in that he is the one he's not, you know, necessarily trying to break you to see if you handle it under pressure, because that never really 100% made sense to me. But more he's just kind of the checking in kind of, you know, you're right. Yeah, he's fine. He's going to crack on. Don't worry about it. So in that respect, he's much more in that kind of Hill Street Blues-esque kind of, you know, the psychop who's experienced enough to know when things are going wrong, but not so grizzled that, you know, he's completely lost himself in the job. And for me, that's yeah, he's a kind of perfect Rob Williams character. Yeah, he is. I mean, and he's quite one. And you sort of feel like he's basically a more well-rounded version of Dredd. Like they are quite similar human beings that get through. I've got, oddly enough, I mean, probably the favorite comedy moment that I have in the small house and other places is from Sensitive Clegg. And it's basically you just chuck Sensitive Clegg next to Dredd and watch, and just off you go. And there's a moment, I mean, he talks for a good long time about poetry and hip hop and what it was like to be, what is he, like a mayor in CNC or something? It's the most preposterous nonsense. That's where Dredd just turns around. He's just like, if you say another fucking word, I will shoot you. Like it, and it's actually comedy gold. All of that's done, I mean, you know, Dirty Frank is used in a similar way. And all of that is perfectly judged, but it's also, what's weird about it is you never get that sense of, you know, Spider-Man in a Marvel swings into a Marvel adventure, basically to deliver some gags and lighten the tone a little bit. Because it's not just lightening the tone. Most of these characters are a tragedy in their own right. Like Dirty Frank, even without what you find out about him at the end, is a tragedy in his own right. It is a bleak humor that you're dealing with here. And the same with Sensitive Clegg. I mean, to even describe him would be to show just what an absolutely an insane idea he is from start to finish. But they work and they have tragedy to them, and they genuinely make me laugh my ass. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about Sensitive Clegg and about humour in Williams' writing, because he deploys humour in a way that I think is unique amongst the current writers of Dredd. You know, everyone has moments of levity, little jokes here and there. But Rob's, as you say, he kind of deploys these preposterous, ridiculous, comedic figures who are tragic in their own right, and it doesn't just leaven the moment, it provides contrast, and for me that's the overriding element of Williams's writing. It's about contrast, it's about the drama, the comedy of putting two opposites together, and it makes it perfect for Dredd, really.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And you're right. I think he probably is the funniest writer. I mean, occasionally he goes out for, I can't remember the name of it. You know, the one with the it's sort of a parody of the sort of billionaire class or the 1% really. The Elevator or something like that, which went for just straight up jokes, and it was very funny and very good. But to me, he's at his best when that stuff's being delivered into the otherwise relentlessly grim world of Dredd, where he's taken what was anyway a pretty grim world and then introduced all sorts of sense of moral doubt and physical decline. So at that point, it's pretty grim. And actually, that the comedy in that capacity just works perfectly well and is very, very well pitched. Even though, I mean, I'm giving it all this sort of quite posh as, but I mean, most of it is just gags about Dirty Frank shitting his pants. I mean, he probably makes 2 shit my pants jokes with Dirty Frank per story. Each and every one of them lands for me.
Come back to what you're talking about, the physicality. Dredd in Williams's writing is almost a Hobbesian construct. The notion of the Leviathan. You know, he is the body politic, and as he decays, then everything decays around him. And again, you get that contrast with Dirty Frank, who is literally decaying, who is both kind of, you know, all the jokes about his personal hygiene and the way he looks and everything. You know, he is right. He is dirty in both senses of the word, and that kind of wordplay is also something I really love about Williams's stuff. You know, it's not straight up puns, but he just riffs on. You know, there's so many dual meanings to his characters that just absolutely great.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I won't lie. I think probably Dirty Frank is my favorite addition to, as a character, to 2000 probably for the last 10 years. Like it's something to do with the manner in which he talks. I mean, it's that sort of third person of himself, but and I think, and it's partly to do with the sense of tragedy to him, but also that kind of chaos agent thing. If you can just put him in a story, weirdly enough, he kind of reminds me of Superhands in Peep Show. If you can just put him in a story and he will function as your chaos agent. Who, I mean, he has far more morality than Superhands and Peep Show. He definitely, well, basically any character on Earth has more morality than Superhands and Peep Show. But you'll put him in the thing and he will work as your chaos agent. And of course, again, like, I don't want to stretch this point too far, but, you know, Dredd is sort of order in physical form, as you're alluded to it. So putting this kind of ramshackle sort of hobo liability genius next to him obviously brings it out. And again, then just to establish a relationship between them, I find incredibly touching. Like it's a bit embarrassing how much I love that relationship. And I would happily read I would like a whole trade of the two of them on holiday together or sat on a bench together and just the two of them talking. I would fucking take it. I would actually read the shit out of that.
I'll pass it down the line.
I'm sure there's a huge market for it. It will do terribly well.
Well, I kind of want to round things out by talking a little bit about Judge Pin, who is the serial killer, which is being collected in Control later this year. And coming back to our discussion about Dredd as an agent of the law, as you know, an agent of faith, of belief. Again, Williams has done something really special with Pin. I think that he's taken a concept to its logical conclusion. You know, with Smiley, it's if you have this all-powerful Justice Department, you are going to get those kind of overarching actors who are manipulating things from above. And with Pin, she is Dredd taken to his logical conclusion. The notion of the law being everything, of being an article of faith, of children being inculcated from the age of 5 or 6 to believe that the law is everything. And you make them killers, but you're putting up a serial killer who believes essentially in the same thing as the quote-unquote hero, who himself is the biggest mass murderer in history.
Yeah. And you sort of, I mean, there's a rich heritage to that, right? Like, in a way, you know, if you think of like sort of Alan Moore thinking through Watchmen or whatever, it's, you know, what is the logical conclusion of this personality type? Like, what would they be? You know, would they be truth, justice, and the American way? Or would they be a bunch of reactionary, you know, impotent nut jobs, basically. And which his conclusion was that it would be the latter. And it's completely fair to obviously take this up and go, well, there'd be a bunch of serial killers. There's also that rich heritage of trying to take the hero and take most of the sort of the skills and even the values, but just make it someone who's willing to do it without, where they believe the ends justifies the means, and they're following the classic thing would be something a bit like Charles Xavier and Magneto. There's some slight differences there. And so on the basis, it's a useful foil. I mean, I've got to say, your question before was, how long would you have had, would you prefer to have those characters live and do more? I thought I would have quite happily had her around for a bit longer, causing trouble, to be honest. And I could even say the same about the Enceladus sort of ending. I thought, oh, that's over now. Whereas I thought, actually, you've got enough material here. This could go on for quite some time, and I would welcome it. But nevertheless, that played out incredibly well. It was beautifully done. It was a brilliant storyline.
I mean, on that point, it's interesting that Rob has decided to take on the consequences of the small house, not with Dredd, but with Hershey. So everything that's happened around Guatemala and Hershey's relations, rather than thinking, well, Dredd can be the one who can sort this. No, actually, it's going to be Hershey. She's going to be the one who's going to sort this out. She's going to have her moment in the sun.
You are now, I'm afraid, entering territory that I do not know, because I get my 2000 ADs from the comic shop, not directly from you guys, and the comic shop is not having the best of times. So I am currently, I think, about 5 weeks, or however long lockdown has been, which may have been 12 years, or may have been, I have no fucking idea. But I am a lockdown away from my prods.
Right, okay. Noted. I'll give you.
But thanks for the spoilers. I came here really to have it all ruined.
Oh, don't play innocent with me. God's sake. Just to kind of round off a little bit, is there anything about Williams' writing that you feel is going to change or needs work? I mean, how arrogant is that? But there are elements with it that you would like to see him go further on. Let's frame it that way.
Mm-hmm. I usually find the endings a bit abrupt, but especially for Enceladus. And I think probably for almost all the stories he's written, which I by the way, think is very often a 2000 AD thing. 2000 AD is not, it's 5 pages of story, a strip every week. It is just fucking delivering the story to you. And it's, I've been going through my Ultimate collections recently, and it's just like, that is very common in 2000 AD, that you're just like, once the story ends, the story ends. We're not going to have like another issue where, we all go for the funeral of whoever died. Like we would say, it's, you're done, wrap the fucker up and let's get on with the next.
You are such an American comic book reader. It's unbelievable.
Well, there really is only one English comic left in my head. That's 2000 AD. So I take my options where I can get them. So, and I sort of take that on point. I'm also super aware of that, because I find it, in the book I've been writing recently, where you're dealing with lots of little stories, I'm very scared of the same thing myself. Of like, you build up something and then you're just like, oh, and then it all got sorted and off we go, and here's the next part. It's quite tough to do. What I'm looking forward to with it, I mean, I sort of have this image of one. I know you guys don't really do absolute editions, but I would like there to be an absolute edition type thing of Rob Williams's Dredd work, which would include Low Life and basically the entire story as it's been so far. And yet I would sort of imagine, and I kind of hope, that in 10 years' time, that will have expanded and will include like a proper Dredd epic. And I feel that he is the man right now to deliver that story. Not just in terms of character and not just in terms of continuity, but in terms of theme and really in terms of writing style, like the ability to create poignancy within a hard-boiled writing style, which is much, much fucking harder than it looks, and something that he does seemingly with ease. Extraordinary, really. And the stage is set. He's basically at that point of skill now, where I sort of hope and expect that within the next 10 years, we will see like, the Small House is already, to me, like in the top 10 Dredd stories, probably in my personal like top 5, but I think would be considered by most people to be in that sort of top tier of stories. I think we'll see from him over the next 10 years something that will be like one of the kinds of stories that in 30 years' time, people will say they read it as a kid, just like we read The Apocalypse War as a kid, and it triggered off a bunch of events that they're still talking about then. That's assuming, of course, that the world survives and the comic industry survives the coronavirus. But on that optimistic note, I would expect that process to take place.
He's going to love that pressure. Absolutely adore it. Going to enjoy talking to him about that. So, I mean, with Dredd, do you think there's more to say? You know, we've seen a new generation of writers come on board as Wagner's output has reduced. You know, he's been quite open about that. But do you think there's more to be said? Do you think there's more places that Dredd can go?
Yeah. I mean, there's certain comic characters which just represent a kind of instinct or thought in humanity that makes them basically undefeatable. And Dredd is one of them. Like, insofar as will people still be interested in exploring ideas of control and freedom? You know, Dredd is going to have something to say. And people have proved very interested in that subject for thousands of years. and I think that will continue to be the case. I also kind of suspect that there's some kind of bizarre energy with Dredd, which is odd, which in a way that I can't quite describe, is wrapped up in the uniform, the absurdity of the design, which is just this sort of kind of almost monolithic slab of pop culture excess and sarcasm. And as a vehicle, you can use that to just do some extraordinary things in comics. Like, I would fully expect that there'll be Judge Dredd stories with things to say, you know, when I'm sitting on my, you know, in my retirement home, eagerly still buying comics and still being asked why the fuck I still read books with pictures in them.
Brilliant, lovely. Well, if people need to find you online, to refute or support what you've said, where can they find you?
To support, I'm sure you meant support. Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Ian Dunt, IANDUNT. Yeah, that's it. That's it, really. I mean, you can join the long lists of abusive commentary. I mean, I won't necessarily see it, but it's worth a go. Yeah.
Brilliant, lovely. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you. I love talking about comics. Hopefully have you on again in the future. But yeah, bro, cheers.
Thanks for having me, man. Bye.
Well, thank you to Ian. I hope you enjoyed that, Earthlets. I certainly did. It was great to just chew over Williams' work on Judge Dredd as some of the highlights of the last few years for me personally on the strip. So yeah, fantastic. If there's a subject that you would like us to cover on the deep dives, or even a creator that you'd like us to interview, please do let us know at thrillcast, that's all one word, THRILLCAST @2000ad.com. And we'll do the best that we can to bring you some pandemic podcasting. So we're back in a few days' time. Next Tuesday, the feature interview for the week is going to be with the one, the only, Mr. Brian Bolland. So do not miss that episode. It was such a privilege to be able to chat with him extensively about his career, not just at 2000 AD, but also in comics in general, with a unique talent, somebody that I know brought a lot of people into 2000 AD, is their first memory of 2000 AD, and a name that's always connected with Judge Dredd. Let's face it, the co-creator of Death, Anderson and Hershey. So yeah, looking forward to putting that out next week. In the meantime, as always, hope you're staying safe. Hope you're looking after each other, and until next time, splendid Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.